Hey guys, tonight we will quietly step into the glittering corridors of the Tudor court, where velvet drapes and jewels could not hide a truth that your nose would never forgive. We will talk about King Henry VIII, not the majestic portrait that history books often paint, but the real man with the smell of sweat, foul breath, and sores tormenting his body. Just hearing it already feels suffocating, doesn't it? You would not survive if you really had to stand close to him. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And by the way, leave me a comment telling me where you are watching from and what time it is right now. I love seeing how our community of night owls stretches across the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Close your eyes and imagine yourself floating through the Great Hall of Hampton Court around the year 1535. The air is thick, not with the aroma of fine wine or the scent of roasted meat, but with a mixture of smells that is hard to describe. At the center of this splendor sits a massive man, his face flushed red, his beard thick and russet, his eyes still flashing with authority. Yes, it is Henry VIII, the most powerful king of England. But the closer you get, the more you realize something is not right. A pungent odor clings to his body, as though the air itself has surrendered. It is the smell of accumulated sweat, of clothes rarely washed, and of illness seeping from festering sores on his legs. This is not a cruel rumor, but a historical record. Henry VIII suffered from chronic leg ulcers that oozed constantly and rarely healed. Imagine a walking odor machine seated on the throne, and you will understand what his courtiers had to endure. Of course, in the Tudor period, bathing was not a daily habit. People believed hot water opened the pores, letting in bad air and disease. So full baths were a rarity, done only when sick or on medical advice. And here you see the irony. A king who could change the religion of a nation but was defeated by a basin of hot water. Truly, man proposes, but odor disposes. To mask it, Henry and his courtiers used perfumes, scented oils, and especially pomanders, small spheres filled with herbs and fragrance, carried in hand. The scene must have looked like a fashion show nobles, lifting pomanders to their noses, pretending to admire jewels, while actually just trying to survive the smell of the throne. The comic part was, if you sneezed too hard and sent your pomander flying into the king's face, you might lose your head as well as your dignity. Historians still debate whether the stench came mainly from poor hygiene or from serious disease. Some argue gout and ulcers alone produced it. Others point to palace conditions, unwashed bedding, leftover food, hundreds of bodies crowded together. Either way, the result was the same. Nobody wanted to stand too close to the king. In Henry's mornings, instead of a refreshing bath like you and I would take, he was merely wiped down with a dry cloth. The hand-washing ritual was only a few drops of rose water sprinkled perfunctorily. In other words, rather than cleansing. It was like spraying perfume on a shirt worn 3 days straight. You know how that goes. Sometimes the mix smells worse than the original. A joke, perhaps. That is why no perfume brand has ever launched Eau de Tudor. Henry VIII was proud of his red hair in youth. Even in middle age, he kept to elaborate grooming, but never washed it with water. Instead, he used perfumed powders and dried herbs, a 16th century version of dry shampoo. Picture his servants spending hours combing out lice and dandruff from his hair, and you will shudder. Some scholars joke that feathered hats and jeweled caps were not only fashion symbols, but magic lids hiding tiny creatures feasting on his scalp. If you still have courage, sit with me at Henry's breakfast table. Forget clean cutlery. Everyone ate with their hands. Those same hands had just wiped on clothes, touched coins, petted dogs, and now tore at roasted meat dipped into shared bowls of sauce. You complain about your phone being dirty, imagine Tudor hands, which had never seen soap, grabbing food. No wonder their stomachs constantly revolted. Scholars debate whether high rates of stomach illness were linked to this habit. But you do not need a doctor to guess the answer. An odd detail instead of plates. Nobles often ate on trenchers, old, the hardened bread used as makeshift dishes. After the meal, soaked with grease and sauce. Trenchers were thrown to dogs or given to the poor. It sounds thrifty. But who would want to eat a second-hand bread plate, infused with the smells of a royal feast? You could call it the world's first fast food, only fast to the toilet. The more you observe, the more you see the paradox. One of Europe's richest courts, draped in velvet and diamonds, yet saturated with body odor, spoiled food, and the constant scratching of lice. Henry VIII could command a pope, execute wives, and change history. But he could not command parasites to leave his hair. And you, luckily, only endure this through words instead of being in that room. Follow the king as he leaves the hall, and the bedchamber door closes behind. If you think this is the only place free of chaos and smell, you are mistaken. Henry VIII's bed was another battlefield, not against enemies, but against countless tiny creatures. The grand oak four-poster bed, draped with velvet and gold-threaded silk, looked heavenly at first glance. But closer, the straw and feather mattress was the perfect home for bedbugs, fleas, and parasites. Imagine the king, who could command a nation, scratching himself raw each night, leaving red marks on his skin. Thankfully, you are lying on clean sheets of the 21st century, not in a 16th century lice spa. The official historical fact: Tudor palaces often spread dry rushes or straw on the floors, and even inside mattresses. The purpose was to absorb moisture and keep warmth. But in reality, they trapped dust, lift our food, and insects. These layers of straw were only changed when they became too dirty, meaning every few months. So the king's bed was nothing less than a luxury hotel for bugs. A strange detail few people know to repel bedbugs. Servants often hung bundles of herbs like lavender or mint around the bedposts. It sounds romantic, but the effect was almost nothing. Insects might dislike the scent, but when there was a whole buffet called the King's Blood, you know they would not refuse. If Henry lived today, he would probably leave a 1-star review for the Tudor bed service on TripAdvisor. And here is where historians still debate. Were Henry's heavy bed curtains erected mainly to keep warmth and create majesty, or also to keep insects out? Some scholars argue the canopy was a defensive weapon against mosquitoes and bedbugs, while others believe it was only for display of wealth. The truth is probably a mix of both. In any case, the curtains only turned the bed into a greenhouse, trapping body odor and moisture, a perfect environment for parasites to thrive. Imagine Henry, his huge body panting after a day of feasting, lying down on the thick mattress. Around him, the smell of velvet mixed with sweat, the odor of ulcers, and the faint tick-tick of bedbugs jumping. Even if you were sleepy, a single itchy bite would be enough to ruin the night. No wonder Henry was often irritable and short-tempered. Who wouldn't be, when every night turned into a silent battle without rest? Perhaps you begin to pity the powerful king, because power could not buy a peaceful sleep. Sometimes the smallest things, like a bedbug bite, could shake the mood of an entire dynasty. And you? Just turning in your clean sheets scented with laundry soap, suddenly feel like the luckiest person in the world. Now sit down on a wooden chair in Henry VIII's chamber, where a Tudor physician bends over preparing tools, You will see no stethoscope, nor gloves, and certainly no concept of washing hands before touching a wound. Instead, there is a razor, small bladers, a few jars of ground herbs mixed with animal fat, and a firm belief in the doctrine of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. People believe disease came from an imbalance of those fluids. It sounds philosophical, but in reality often turned patients into victims of frightening treatments. The clear historical fact: Henry VIII, throughout his later years, suffered from severe leg ulcers, wounds that oozed pus and never healed. Doctors often used methods of cutting, lancing, draining fluid, then applying ointments. Imagine that scene: no anesthetic, not antiseptic. A sharp blade pressing into an inflamed sore, Henry roaring in pain, and the room filled with the foul smell of putrid discharge mixed with herbal fat. Just hearing it makes you shudder, doesn't it? But this was the daily reality of a mighty king. A strange detail few people know in some records: remedies for wounds were made from crocodile dung or crushed cobwebs. People believed they could draw out poison from the body. If today you went to a pharmacy asking for crocodile cream for ulcers, the pharmacist would look at you as if you had just fallen from the 16th century. And this is one of history's ongoing debates. Did these treatments actually make Henry deteriorate faster? Some historians argue that lancing with dirty tools and bandaging with reused cloth only worsened his ulcers. Others believe the main cause was his massive weight and a diet too rich in meat and sugar, making healing impossible. Whichever side is right, the truth remains: Henry's health declined day by day, and his treatment chamber was nothing short of torture. You sit observing, watching Henry's face flush red, his breath heavy, his hands gripping the chair as the barber surgeon continues the work. You realize the bitter irony: one of the most powerful men in Europe, who could sign death warrants and change the religion of a nation, was utterly helpless before a wound on his leg. Truly, he could defy the Pope, but not the germ. If Henry's feasting made people grimace at filthy eating habits, then his treatment room made you see in the Tudor era. Sometimes the cure was worse than the disease, and as you rest your head on a modern pillow, under clean blankets scented with fresh laundry, you silently thank fate that you do not live in a time when a barber could cut your hair and cut your leg with the same blade. Follow the kitchen smoke drifting through the cold stone corridors of Hampton Court, and you feel the air growing heavier, stifling. When the heavy wooden door opens, you fall into another world: the Tudor royal kitchen, the place that fed not only Henry VIII but also hundreds of courtiers. If in your imagination this was a gleaming room with shining copper pots and chefs in white coats, then, prepare yourself, because the truth might ruin your appetite. Red flames from giant charcoal ovens pour out thick black smoke, filling the air. The smell of charred meat mixes with fish beginning to spoil, blended with animal fat splattered across old, rotting straw on the floor. Take one more step, and your shoes stick to the dark, sticky surface, where new rushes were laid only a few times a year, and beneath it, yes, a biological museum of grease, breadcrumbs, bones, and countless bacteria you would rather not name. The official historical fact: Tudor kitchens were a massive system, with Hampton Court alone employing more than 200 staff, preparing up to 1,000 meals each day. There were no refrigerators, no clean running water like we have today. Food was preserved with salt, smoke, or simply luck. Spoiled meat was covered with spices to mask the odor. Fish left overnight was sprinkled with herbs to hide the truth. A strange detail few noticed: there was often a food taster before dishes were served to the king. You might think this was to guard against poison, but in reality there was another reason to check whether the meat was too rotten. That meant a courtier had to bravely test a slightly rancid chicken leg, just to be sure the king would not end up with stomach cramps. That job alone proves that being a Tudor courtier was sometimes no more glamorous than being a modern delivery man. And here historians still debate, was Henry VIII's gout and severe stomach pains due to heredity, or did his diet and filthy kitchen conditions drive him into illness? Some argue that the huge quantities of red meat, beer, and sugar he consumed daily surely overwhelmed his liver, kidneys, and stomach. Others point out that much of the court ate similarly, while Henry alone suffered more severely, suggesting a genetic factor. Perhaps the truth lies in both bad genes and dirty pots. You observe a young cook holding a knife to gut a fish, his hands shiny with grease, wiping them on an apron that likely had not been washed for weeks. Then he casually cuts bread, grabs vegetables, stirs a pot. You sit there, thinking quietly. If Gordon Ramsay were here, he would probably shout until the velvet drapes of the palace shook. A light joke, but you can't help laughing. When trays of food are carried out, you notice the paradox. The feast looks magnificent. Golden roasted chicken, fragrant pied, sparkling wine, but its roots lie in a chaotic kitchen, crawling with germs, where washing dishes simply meant dipping them into a communal tub of cold water. Wooden plates cracked, spoons oily, knives not yet scraped clean of blood from the last cut. As you take a deep breath, the smoky air mixed with the fishy stench leaves your throat dry. At that moment, you think if only you had a medical mask, you would instantly be crowned noble of the future. And then you remember something important. Henry, with his always overfilled stomach, his endless supply of red meat and ale, was himself the victim of this very kitchen. His slow death came not only from genes or leg ulcers, but also from each dish cooked in chaos. So next time you sit by your clean gas stove, hear the hum of your extractor fan, or open the fridge to find food still fresh, smile with gratitude, because you have just escaped the Tudor culinary nightmare without ever stepping into Henry VIII's smoky kitchen. Now you return to the Great Hall, where Henry VIII's banquet begins. Let me guide you slowly, as though you are seated at the long table covered with golden damask, watching the massive king gripping a greasy roast bone. Do not expect elegance like in costume dramas. The truth was closer to a no-rules buffet than a royal feast. Music swells, trumpets sound, and dozens of courtiers, cooks, and servants carry in huge platters of meat. A golden roast suckling pig, half a deer, pheasants, swans, even peacocks stuffed with spices, all arranged on wooden or silver dishes, sometimes even on old bread called trenchers. And here is the curious, or rather horrifying, fact. After these trenchers soaked up grease and juices, they were tossed to dogs or given to the poor. Yes, you heard right. Eating from the bread plates used at the king's table. The official historical record, Henry VIII, often held enormous banquets that could last all day. At each meal, he might eat dozens of dishes, with a particular love for red meat, pastries, and ale. Sugar and spices were luxuries, and since the king had them in excess, his teeth quickly decayed. Records describe his blackened teeth, swollen gums, and foul breath. His unfortunate personal trademark. A strange detail few people know at the Tudor table. Forks were almost absent. Yes, both king and courtiers ate with their hands. Hands that had only been dabbed in rosewater that morning to pretend cleanliness. So everyone tore meat, dipped sauchers, then wiped their hands on tablecloths or cloaks. Imagine sitting next to Henry, watching his large hand grab a venison steak, dip it in sauce, laughing heartily, grease glistening under candlelight. You would want to reach instantly for a bottle of hand sanitizer. Historians still debate whether the overindulgence in meat, sugar, and ale was the main cause of Henry's severe gout, or whether his lack of physical activity in old age was the true killer. Some scholars point out that most palace dishes were heavily salted and over-roasted, combined with the habit of eating with bare hands at filthy tables, leading to disease. Others argue that the problem lay in his massive weight, his legs unable to bear such a body. Either way, one thing is certain, every lavish banquet was also a slow-acting poison. You hear bones cracking, fat dripping onto the wooden table, pewter cups, an alloy containing lead slosh with beer, and pewter contained lead, which over time caused heavy metal poisoning. So even when Henry raised his cup in cheerful toasts, he was secretly swallowing another dose of poison. One entertainment at feasts was show dishes, such as a giant pie that, when cut, released live birds, or a roast pig stuffed with chickens, inside which were pigeons. These spectacles both entertained and showed power. But imagine, in a smoky kitchen, meat kept too long, animals not properly cleaned, all crammed into one magic trick. Simply eating it without stomach pain was already a miracle. You watch the courtiers, they try to look cheerful, laughing along with the king, but discreetly wipe grease on their clothes. Some toss bones to the floor, where hunting dogs barked and snapped. Noirs, chaos, voix, dogs fighting, music, all mixed with the smell of food and sweat. You wonder how could people endure this day after day? The answer is simple. If you could not endure, you were finished, perhaps literally. For a light joke, if you brought a box of wet wipes to this banquet, the whole court would probably see you as a sorcerer. Wet wipes would be hailed as the magic of the future, protecting them from every illness. But in the 16th century, the only magic they believed in was sprinkling more cinnamon and ginger on spoiled meat. After his belly was stuffed, Henry slumped back in his chair. Grease clung to his beard, his hands slick with fat. A servant approached with a basin of rose water to wash. But it was only a ritual. Fingers dipped lightly, wiped on a cloth, and then he grabbed more fruit for dessert. Grapes, figs, sweet pears, all drowned in sugar and honey. Henry was addicted to sweets, and this was one reason his teeth fell out as the years went by. Another clear historical fact. Medical records of the time confirm that Henry VIII lost many teeth in old age. His gums swollen, his breath foul. One scholar once commented, perhaps the smell from his mouth was worse than from his legs. It sounds cruel, but you must admit, a little funny. A strange detail because forks were rare. Many ate with knives, cutting and spearing food straight into their mouths. Sometimes, knives that had just sliced raw meat were used to cut cooked meat. Yes, preparing for a Tudor banquet was like a stomach-churning challenge. And historians have another debate where Henry's infamous rages, the temper that led to the execution of wives and courtiers, partly caused by toothache and indigestion. Some argue that the combination of chronic pain, acidic stomach, and gout made him prone to fury. Others insist he was inherently tyrannical, and illness only revealed his nature. Either way, imagine attending a council while your teeth throb and your belly churns with rotten meat, who wouldn't explode. You glance at the hall floor after the banquet bones. Breadcrumbs, spilled wine everywhere. Servants swept it all to the ground, adding to layers already thick with filth. Rats feasted freely once the king departed. And yes, rats were the uninvited guests of the Tudor court. Add a bit of satire, if you think modern weddings have many uninvited guests sneaking food. Invite Henry, and he would say, "In my day it was more fun. Dogs, rats, and lice joined the feast too." After the midday banquet, Henry heaves himself up, heavy as a boulder. He staggers back to his private chamber, where another ritual awaits, dealing with the aftermath of mountains of meat, ale, and sweets. And here, prepare yourself, for Tudor toilets were nothing like modern bathrooms. You follow Henry VIII after his gluttonous meal into a private room. Do not expect anything gleaming or clean like a hotel bathroom. Instead, you see a velvet upholstered chair, hollowed in the middle with a round hole. Beneath it, a metal chamber pot. It was given the grand title, the private throne. In truth, this was Henry's toilet. Imagine a king who could command a nation, defy the Pope, yet when it came to relieving himself, he sat on a hole in a chair. Not much different from a child's potty seat. History is full of paradoxes that make you laugh and cringe at once. The historical record is clear. A special servant, the groom of the stool, was tasked with assisting the king in his toilet matters. Yes, you heard correctly. Their duties included cleaning up, carrying the pot, and even wiping the king. Yet this was not a lowly job. On the contrary, it was one of the most powerful positions in the Tudor court. It sounds absurd, but think carefully. Whoever was with the king in his most private moments, daily at his side, had the chance to whisper advice, ask for favors, or influence decisions others never could. Historians record that many grooms of the stool wielded great influence over grants of land and appointments. A king could shut out his nobles, but on the velvet toilet throne, he could not pretend to be untouchable. A light joke here. If today you went to a job interview and your resume read experience cleaned the king's chamber pot, skilled at persuading the boss while he sat, the recruiter would surely freeze for a few seconds. A strange detail few people know. Henry VIII's chamber pot was often made of silver or pewter, with a lid and lined with velvet, embroidered with fine detail. On the outside it was luxurious, but the technology was still primitive. Waste was carried away by servants to a common palace latrine or simply thrown into the moat or surrounding ditch. Historians still debate whether placing latrines near kitchens and food stores indirectly caused many outbreaks of disease in the palace. Some argue that wind carried odor and bacteria through the halls, spreading quickly. Others counter that the Tudors believed in miasma, or poisonous air rather than germs. So placing toilets out of sight was simply the idea that what you don't see can't harm you. Picture Henry sitting there, heavy and wheezing. A few attendants stand nearby, pretending to be solemn as though attending a council meeting. No one dares laugh, even as the foul odor hangs thick in the air. Courtiers observed carefully the king's products to report on his health. Yes, exactly color, consistency, even frequency, all became political subjects. To add a joke, you imagine today, a colonoscopy doctor has influence. But in Tudor times, just looking at the king's chamber pot was enough to become a national advisor. Yet the king was not the only one with this privilege. Hampton Court Palace had dozens of garderobes, Tudor communal toilets. In practice, they were just rows of wooden seats with holes, leading to cesspits or chutes dumping into the river. The smell was unbearable. Flies swarming, filth clinging around. Some records describe people scattering dried herbs or ash to mask the odor. Think of it like dropping a sachet in a public toilet today. Only far less effective. Historians continue to discuss whether communal cesspit toilets caused dysentery and cholera to spread widely in court. The palace housed hundreds, even thousands, officials, guards, musicians, cooks. Tons of waste poured in daily. There was no treatment system, no proper drains. In truth, all of London was like this, a city reeking of stench. A bizarre detail in Henry's private room. Bundles of rosemary, lavender, and mint were hung around the velvet throne. The idea was that the fragrance would mask the stench. In reality, it created a strange cocktail of odors, half sweet, half nauseating. Imagine standing next to a perfume sprayer placed in a stable. That was the experience of visiting a Tudor palace. And of course, some scholars doubt the effectiveness of this. They ask, did masking odor with herbs only make people less conscious of hygiene? The answer seems obvious. Fragrance was only a temporary curtain. Sitting in that room, you realize a great paradox. Henry VIII could force his people to change religion, dissolve monasteries, execute anyone. But when it came to relieving himself, he was just another man, awkward, dependent, vulnerable. Perhaps it was this very moment that made the grooms of the stool the most powerful men of all. For if you witnessed a king in his most human state, then no secret remained. A light joke, if you had a time machine and brought Henry a roll of 3-ply lavender-scented toilet paper, he would probably proclaim you saint of sanitation and record your name in history. But the real consequences were not funny. Poor sanitation spread bacteria. Dirty waste channels could seep back into wells, where the palace drew its drinking and cooking water. This led to countless intestinal diseases, from dysentery to typhoid. Henry VIII, already weakened by ulcers and obesity, surely absorbed his share of poisons. A clear historical fact during the Tudor period. The sweating sickness, a mysterious infectious disease marked by high fever and profuse sweating, killed many in England. Some scholars suspect that poor palace sanitation, especially waste systems, helped spread it. Modern historians still debate, did Henry VIII's rapid health decline relate directly to palace sanitation? Some argue that living in such a germ-filled environment worsened his ulcers into chronic infection. Others say the main cause was his obesity and indulgent lifestyle, with hygiene a secondary factor. Either way, it is hard to deny each time he sat on the velvet throne, the entire court held its breath. For the health of the realm was tied to the king's chamber pot. Imagine today how annoyed you get when a toilet breaks down. Now imagine Henry VIII, one of the most powerful men in the world, forced his whole life to use a metal pot with no flush, no water. The only difference was his pot was velvet-lined and had servants in charge. Sometimes, luxury is only a velvet cloak covering technological poverty. A third joke, if Henry VIII ever saw a modern flush toilet, he would probably call it dark magic and order the execution of the toilet before he could enjoy it. You sit there, feeling the damp little room, candlelight flickering, walls hung with dried herbs. Henry wheezes heavily, while his courtiers remain utterly silent. The space is a mixture of stench, fragrance, sweat, and faded velvet. Suddenly you feel a strange gratitude for modern life, for clean water, soap, public sanitation, a world where relieving yourself is a private act, not a political ritual. You leave that room, carrying in your mind an image you cannot erase. Henry VIII, a king with absolute power, yet imprisoned by his own body and a primitive sanitary system. You leave the stifling bedchamber, stepping softly as if afraid to wake an entire era. But no, Henry VIII's raspy snoring continues, drowned by the creak of wood and the salty stench of a body that never knew soap. You think you have escaped that scene, but the great door opens, and you are swept into another world, one where royal splendor mixes with filth beyond belief. Henry VIII's evening banquet begins. Before you is the Great Hall, a dazzling space with glowing candlelight, a long red damask carpet, and rows of tables, so long it would take you half a walk to reach the end. On the tables, massive roasts, venison pies, smoked salmon, and towers of sugar-dusted pastries. All proclaim the wealth of a king who believed he was chosen by God to rule. But as you draw nearer, the scent is nothing like the delicacies of a modern wedding feast. The meat slightly rancid, the fish a bit strong, and the sweets so cloying your teeth ache just by smelling. Historians still debate the level of food safety at these banquets. Some argue that with so many cooks, the dishes were reasonably prepared, but many records note no refrigeration, poor hygiene, and the habit of drowning spoiled food in spices meant the risk of food poisoning was constant. Some joke that in the Tudor court, if you did not debar your enemies, you might fall by a 2-day-old meat pie. A curious fact, few know people ate with their hands. Yes, even the mightiest king tore into roast chicken with fingers never washed with soap, then dipped them into shared sauce bowls. Spoons and knives existed, but forks were virtually unknown in England. Plates were replaced by trenchers, hard old bread slices used as edible platters, soaked with grease and gravy. For the poor, being given these greasy bread plates was a blessing, though you and I might wince at the thought. Imagine it hands that had just gripped a beer cup, wiped sweat from a brow, now tearing meat and raising it to the mouth. No wet wipes, no hand sanitizer. If Henry VIII lived today, he would be every buffet restaurant's nightmare. The banquet is loud. Boisterous. Instruments play. Knights laugh heartily. Ladies whisper. But beneath the velvet and gold, the hall floor is littered with crumbs, gnawed bones, dripping grease. Servants simply swept scraps to the ground for dogs or beggars. You step once, hearing a crack, not a jewel, but a chicken bone underfoot. A light joke to ease you if someone invited you to time travel. You would refuse the moment you learned you must share a sauce bowl with hundreds of guests. And you notice something else. The king's smile. Or rather, the gap-ridden teeth. The foul breath with each bite. Sugar, a luxury of the 16th century, became Henry's obsession. Candies, honey pastries, sugar-spiced wine, all rotted his teeth. Historians still argue whether his chronic toothache contributed to his temper, his irritability, and violence. Some say certainly yes. Imagine sitting in council all day with a throbbing toothache. Would you stay calm in that banquet? You sense the contradiction. Clearly dazzling lights, but air thick with food smells and unwashed bodies. Pewter cups passed hand to hand. Greasy fingers glistening. Broken smiles. This was Tudor splendor glittering on the outside. Squalid beneath. Unbearable to anyone used to soap and clean water. You remember the midday bed, where bedbugs lurked beneath the fabric. And now, amid the grand feast, you see lice, flies, even dogs and cats lurking, waiting for scraps. Historical truth can be that raw. You sigh softly, reminding yourself that Henry VIII, the king who changed a nation's religion, was still only a man trapped in stench, ulcers, rotten teeth, and too many feasts. And what makes you smile is this odd contrast: the most powerful man in England, powerless before the smallest details of daily life. You sit quietly in the great hall for a long while, then suddenly hear the slap of footsteps, the shouts of cooks from behind. So you decide to follow the dark corridor leading to the kitchens, the place where that entire empire of lavish dining was truly created. If in your imagination the king's kitchen must be a paradise of cleanliness and order, then you are about to be spectacularly disappointed. The wooden door opens, and heat rushes into your face like opening an oven in midsummer. Smoke billows from blazing hearths, mingling with the smell of burnt fat, rancid fish, and the damp mustiness of the rushes spread across the floor. You take a step. Your shoes stick, as if walking on a mixture of toffee and mud. People say that at Hampton Court, the kitchen floors were only covered with fresh rushes a few times a year, meaning that for months, grease, breadcrumbs, bones, and refuse piled up, creating a microbial stew underfoot. A memorable historical fact, the royal kitchens alone employed more than 200 workers, divided into specialized departments. Some roasted meat, others made sauces. Some handled soups, others pastries. This vast system could prepare more than 1,000 meals daily to feed the entire court. But high productivity did not mean hygiene. Food was stacked high. Game hung in the open. Fish salted carelessly. And foul odors seeped into every crack of the stone walls. A little-known detail to test food quality. There was always a taster. Everyone assumes it was to guard against poison. In reality, sometimes their main job was simply to check whether the meat was too spoiled. Imagine a courtier in red velvet, forcing down a slightly sour bite of chicken. Nodding edible, enough for the king's table. Truly, in that position, a quick death by poison might be preferable to a slow decline from endless diarrhea. Historians still debate was Henry VIII's failing health gout, obesity, stomach pains, mainly genetic, or did this chaotic kitchen help kill him? Some insist the diet of red meat, sugar, and ale was the culprit. Others note that many nobles ate the same but lived long. So perhaps the filthy preparation was the fatal blow. You see a cook cutting fish, his hands slick with grease, then wiping them on an apron stained for months. Without pause, he cuts bread, grabs vegetables, stirs a soup pot. If there were a cooking show back then, modern viewers would faint in the first round. A small joke if Gordon Ramsay stumbled in. He would scream until the palace roof shook. Deeper inside, you encounter blackened cauldrons boiling beside a dishwashing tub. Forget soap or sterilizing hot water. Here it is, just a cold basin, used for hundreds of wooden plates, pewter spoons, and butcher knives. In fact, the same water was reused many times. If you dare look down, you see a greasy scum and floating scraps, like some apocalyptic stew. In the chaos, one striking detail emerges: the overwhelming smell of spices, cinnamon, nutmeg, ginger, pepper, all used in huge quantities, not to delight the palate, but to mask spoiled meat. Spices were as costly as gold, yet the king spent lavishly just to cover the stench. You catch the sweet hot scent of cinnamon mixed with the sourness of fish, a symphony you would never want to hear again. You suddenly remember all those golden platters in the candlelit Great Hall emerged from this dark, filthy place. The paradox is clear: outward glory built upon inward decay. A little further, you find servants preparing game, deer, rabbits, pheasants, animals hung upside down for days to tenderize the meat. Some historians call it a gourmet tradition, but most agree it was a gateway to bacterial hell. No wonder stomach aches, diarrhea, and even epidemics spread throughout the court. You smile wryly. Perhaps Henry VIII thought himself God's favored king. But in truth, he lived inside a giant microbiological experiment. Now you turn and leave the kitchen, your chest heavy with smoke, grease, and damp stench. You think of yourself with just a refrigerator and a bottle of dish soap. Hundreds packed together creates an aroma as distinctive as a gym after peak hours. On the long white draped tables, roasts, pies, and baked fish gleam golden. But when you look closer, you see unwashed hands of courtiers grabbing food directly. No forks, no modern etiquette. Table manners here meant tearing meat with fingers and dipping into shared bowls of sauce. The official historical fact, the fork was not common in Tudor England, though it had appeared in Italy. At the court of Henry VIII, most diners still ate with their hands of meat. Everything else was handled by fingers. A strange detail few people know. Instead of porcelain plates, they often ate on trenchers, thick. The hard slices of bread used to hold food, grease, and meat scraps might be eaten, thrown to the dogs, or given to the poor waiting outside. So you could say in the Tudor court, even plates had an edible expiration date. And here historians still debate, did the reuse of trenchers truly represent charity, sharing food with the poor? Or was it simply a convenient way to discard waste? Some call it Tudor welfare, but others insist it only proved their disregard for hygiene and public health. You observe Henry VIII, the massive king in a red velvet robe embroidered with gold weighing tens of kilos. He sits at the highest table, where all eyes look up. His broad hands tear into a roast, fat running down his fingers, waving his hand and splattering grease onto a nearby noble's clothes. The noble forces a smile, quickly wiping it off, for who would dare show displeasure to the king? Meanwhile, do you notice the absurdity? Henry grabs a piece of bread with greasy fingers, then with the same hand, crumbs, and germs enjoy a free journey. You think if hand sanitizer existed here, it would be hailed as holy magic. Music rises. The atmosphere grows livelier. Foreign envoys sit nearby, trying to be polite, but their faces betray horror. An Italian guest must surely wonder, I left elegant Venice to come here. To eat with my hands like a child. Was this the right choice? As the banquet continues, the floor turns into a battlefield. Bones, nutshells, crusts scattered, swept down for dogs to take or servants to trample. The smell of ale fills the hall. Henry VIII drains a large cup of wine, chuckling, liquid dripping into his red beard in greasy drops. A quick-thinking courtier hands him a cloth, but instead of wiping properly, he dabs once and resumes eating. You start to feel queasy. Your stomach twists, not from hunger, but from the sight, hundreds of hands tearing into shared platters, then back to mouths, then back again. This was the Tudor buffet, but instead of choosing, everyone shared the same dish. If you've ever been annoyed at a modern banquet by someone not using serving spoons, this scene would make you faint instantly. A light joke if you wore disposable plastic gloves, like in a modern snack shop at a Tudor banquet. You'd surely be branded a witch. And then you realize these very banquets, glittering outside but chaotic inside, were the hidden cause of disease outbreaks in the court. People ate, drank, touched hands, then shook hands, then touched objects, then ate again. It was a never-ending bacterial cycle. You sighed quietly, looking at Henry VIII, the man who had the power to change England's religion, yet could not change his filthy eating habits. And you smile. Bitterly, power could not protect him from the tiniest germs. You leave the banquet table, thinking you'll find fresher air, but the door opens into another hidden corner of the palace, leading you to a place few mention when speaking of Tudor. Splendor, the royal toilet, or more precisely, the throne of power, Henry VIII's velvet-covered commode. It sounds luxurious, but you soon see the truth. It was only a wooden chair, or velvet-covered seat, with a round hole in the middle. beneath which sat a metal or ceramic chamber pot. And here is the strange fact. The man responsible for tending to the king's needs was one of the most influential courtiers, the groom of the stool. The official historical fact, the position of groom of the stool, did exist, and the holder was considered the king's closest confidant. Why? Because he attended Henry in his most private moments, knew the king's health and moods, and thus could influence political decisions. A velvet-covered wooden chair was the key to power. A peculiar detail: the groom of the stool did not just clean, he also had to observe and record the king's health through his products. If signs of illness appeared, he could report directly to physicians. So sometimes, the fate of the nation was tied to the color and consistency of the king's chamber pot. You might laugh, but it is a fact recorded in history. And this too is a cluster of scholarly debate. Historians still the king, or truly a political advisor in disguise, exploiting that closeness to manipulate power. Some argue they were only silent hands, while others insist no one could be near Henry VIII in his most private moments without holding the secrets of the court. You take a breath, but instantly regret it. The air here reeks of damp, acrid stench, and a faint scent of herbs scattered to mask the odor. You think immediately of a modern public toilet and silently thank the 21st century air freshener spray can, which is far more of a wonder than Tudor velvet ever was. Something makes you laugh sometimes. The king received courtiers even while seated on this throne. Yes, the very place where he relieved himself could also be the place where decrees were signed. Imagine a knight solemnly reading a military report, while the king sat at ease in a posture you would rather not picture further. Truly power that stinks. In the literal sense, you shudder as you recall the palace waste system. Waste was not treated as today. It was often dumped straight into cesspits. Or worse, poured into the moat surrounding the castle. Historians have noted this lack of sanitation was a key reason disease spread so quickly. And perhaps, when a strong wind blew across the moat, the whole of Hampton Court was engulfed in a smell too hard to name. You smile wryly if you lived then. You would never again complain about your office toilet running out of paper. Henry VIII could order beheadings, divorce and remarry, overthrow the church, but he could do nothing more than entrust his body to a ceramic pot. And you realize this is the exquisite paradox of history. The mightiest man in the kingdom could not escape the simplest human need. You follow the king leaving the foul-smelling room, expecting relief. But what awaits you is another silent battlefield, Henry VIII's bed. Supposedly, the resting place of England's most powerful man should have been a heaven of velvet, fragrance, and peace. But instead it was the home of an invisible army, fleas, bedbugs, and countless insects whose very names make you shudder. The official historical fact: Tudor beds were often four-posters, draped with heavy velvet curtains, with mattresses stuffed with feathers or straw, luxurious in appearance, but in reality, an ideal breeding ground for bedbugs. By day they hid in the wooden crevices. At night, they emerged to suck blood, leaving itchy bites that kept the sleeper tossing. And Henry VIII, with his huge body and heavy sweating, was the perfect all-you-can-eat buffet. A strange detail few know to fight fleas and bedbugs. People sprinkled herbs like mint, leona, or basil around the bed. They believed strong scents would drive parasites away. But in truth, fragrance only turned the room into a rather ridiculous mix. 1 part herbal freshness, 1 part unwashed body, plus the smell of insects and musty bedding. Imagine spraying Chanel perfume on a shirt not washed for 2 weeks. And historians still debate an intriguing detail: the curtains around Henry VIII's bed. Some say they were mainly symbols of power, creating grandeur and privacy, like a second throne. Others insist they were meant to block drafts and More importantly, keep insects out. Of course, no curtain could stop hungry bedbugs. Perhaps they were both decorative and a psychological comfort for the king, rather than an effective barrier. You sit by the bed, watching Henry VIII lower himself onto the mattress. The wooden frame creaks. The whole room seems to shake. He closes his eyes, seeking peace after a day drenched in smells and noise. But minutes later, the itching comes. He shifts, scratching arms, scratching legs, wheezing. You can almost hear bedbugs crawling in the wood, a sound that makes your skin crawl, and you chuckle if Henry VIII lived in the 21st century. He would be a VIP customer of pest control services, and perhaps would sue Hampton Court for dirty bed service. The true horror lay in the consequences. Continuous bites caused scratches that easily became infected, worsening the leg ulcers that plagued him for years. Each small bite could turn into a large abscess, further weakening the king's health. The royal physicians still clung to the four humors theory, blaming blood, phlegm, yellow bile, or black bile imbalance. Instead of realizing the real culprits were the bedbugs, you see a clear paradox. The king could issue, and now comes the true medical tragedy. The official historical fact throughout many of his later years, Henry VIII was tormented by leg ulcers, particularly on his calves. These wounds never fully healed, constantly oozed pus, caused severe pain, and gave off a foul stench. The cause may have come from injuries during horseback riding, even lizardung, dog feces, or cobwebs, mixed into ointments applied directly to the wounds. People believed these would draw out the poison. The result was that Henry VIII suffered greater pain, and the wounds became even more infected. Historians still debate, did these methods truly worsen Henry's condition? Or were they merely useless and allowed the disease to progress naturally? Some argue the physicians hastened his death by spreading infection further with each treatment. Others claim that with the knowledge of the time, they did all they could. Either way, the result was a body slowly rotting, even while wrapped in silk and brocade. You take a deep breath, but that is a mistake. The room is now thick with the smell of ulcerous pus mixed with herbal balms. Like an olfactory hot pot, no one would want to taste. And you tell yourself in the 21st century, Henry VIII would certainly have been a loyal customer of the pharmacy, and his medical record would likely fit into just one course of antibiotics lasting a few weeks. A light bit of satire to make you smile: if handheld vacuum cleaners had existed then, Tudor physicians might have used them to suck out pus for the king, and it might have been hailed as a medical invention branded Henry VIII. You notice the nearby attendants, their faces tight with discomfort, but absolutely not daring to show disgust. They still fold their hands, nodding, pretending that the overpowering odor was only a rather strong perfume. In that suffocating air lies the greatest paradox: Henry VIII, the man who changed the religion of a nation, could not change the fate of his own legs. He was bound to a rotting body, a prisoner of his own flesh. A modern comparison: you may feel embarrassed when visiting a dentist just to have tartar removed. Imagine Henry lying still while a barber surgeon, a man who cut hair and performed surgery, pressed a blade into his ulcer. A dental cleaning would feel like heaven in comparison. Do you see it? The bed full of bedbugs, the ulcerated leg, the stench of the body, all merged into a horror ASMR soundtrack of the Tudor court. And yet, amid these grotesque details, you feel your heartbeat slowing, your eyes heavy. Perhaps it is precisely the repetition of sounds and images, filthy hygiene scenes, groans, bizarre remedies that accidentally become an effective lullaby. You have just left the room heavy with the smell of ointment, then the kitchens with a giant petri dish that fed the entire court. The official historical fact: Henry VIII's kitchens at Hampton Court were among the largest in 16th century Europe. They employed hundreds of cooks, servants, and laborers, preparing thousands of meals daily for the king, the royal family, and hundreds of courtiers. It sounds grand, but in reality it was more like a chaotic factory, damp, disorderly, and reeking. Picture it: blazing fires, cauldrons boiling, carcasses of fish and game hanging from hooks, fat dripping onto the floor, and the floor was not tiled and clean as today, but covered with straw to soak up grease and waste. After days, that straw turned into a damp, sticky mess, both a slipping hazard and a luxury apartment for rats and cockroaches. A strange detail few know to check whether food was safe. The court often used a food taster. This person ate a small portion of each dish, both to ensure it was not poisoned and to see if it caused immediate stomach cramps. Imagine if the taster collapsed 10 minutes later. The banquet was cancelled. Surely, this was not on anyone's dream job list in Tudor times. Historians still debate how high was the death rate from food poisoning in the Tudor court. Some argue that most stomach illnesses came from poorly preserved food, not poison. Others insist that in a world of constant intrigue, poisoning was always a lurking danger. Either way, you see that Henry VIII was truly brave to eat every day. For his banquet was nothing short of a gamble. You step deeper into the kitchen, the heat hitting you like entering a steam room, but the smell is anything but pleasant. Mixed in the air is the odor of charred meat, spoiled fish, doused in spices to mask it, coal smoke, and the sour stench of vegetable and meat wash water recycled from a muddy well. You can feel the dampness clinging to your skin, like eating at a buffet inside a public restroom. A small joke to help you sleep: if Gordon Ramsay had been around then, he would have shouted at the Tudor cooks. This kitchen isn't Hell's Kitchen. It's hell itself. The court's food, though lavish, king and courtiers. Imagine them all tearing into the same roast with bare fingers, dipping into a shared sauce bowl. A Tudor banquet was the perfect place for germs to hold a family reunion. Modern researchers believe that the mortality rate from intestinal disease among Tudor nobles may have been higher than among peasants, because their luxury diet, heavy in meat, sugar, and ale, destroyed their health. Some even joke that peasants, though poor, lived longer thanks to eating fresh vegetables. You feel as though each step through the kitchen is a brush with microbial death. But Henry VIII saw it as pride. A table overflowing with meat meant power. And so he kept eating, kept drinking, even as his waistline grew wider by the day. You exhale, leaving the smoky, greasy kitchen, and soon hear the clash of cutlery and voices from the banquet hall. In the candlelight, you catch Henry VIII's smile, a smile that any modern dentist would quit their job after seeing blackened and loose. You step closer and see his gums red and inflamed, sometimes bleeding as he chews meat. His breath reeks like wine mixed with pus. No different than opening a garbage bin under summer sun. It sounds harsh, but even his courtiers recorded that standing near the king was sometimes worse than walking through a stable. A curious detail: the Tudor way of brushing teeth was not with a brush. They used a cloth to rub, or chewed twigs dipped in vinegar, salt, or charcoal powder. Creative, perhaps, but useless against bacteria. Some recipes even eroded enamel faster. Henry VIII, with his endless craving for sugar, only worsened his pain with abscesses, swelling, and chronic agony. Historians still debate: did Henry's famous rages boards? He grimaces but swallows, for a king must never show weakness. Instead of a toothbrush, he chews herbs to mask the stench. But forgive me, it was like spraying perfume on a trash heap. A small joke for you to chuckle if Colgate toothpaste had existed then. Henry VIII would have been the perfect face for the slogan, "Before it's too late." In truth, every Tudor smile was dreadful. Nobles considered blackened teeth and foul breath normal. As long as their faces were painted white and their lips red, they even used lead and mercury cosmetics, which only rotted gums further. The price of beauty was truly unbearable. You wonder, how did the court endure it? Simple, they all smelled the same. When everyone stank, no one dared complain. But pity the foreigners, Italian or Spanish envoys must have been shocked when kissing the king's hand while inhaling a stench like a biological morgue. And then you realize, teeth were only one piece of the puzzle. Henry VIII's body was a fortress rotting from within. Hilnona silk, velvet, and power. You raise your eyes and see beneath the jewel-studded crown Henry's once glorious red hair now thinning, greasy, and seemingly alive with a bustling community of insects. The official historical fact, the flaming red hair of Henry VIII was once his pride in youth. In early shampoo, but a crude version powder from rosemary, lavender, even wheat flour. It was rubbed into the hair to absorb oil, but over time clumped and hardened into giant flakes like monstrous dandruff. When Henry sat at banquets, just bowing his head could release a dusting of white, as though he had walked through a tiny snowstorm. Historians still debate were the elaborate Tudor hats and feathered headpieces symbols of fashion, or simply tools to hide dirty hair and scaly. From time to time, they stop to flick away a small brown louse wriggling in the strands. Henry sits still, seemingly unfazed, as if it were no different than you swatting a mosquito in summer. To him, it was simply part of life. You imagine reaching into the air around that hair, the sharp scent of powder mixed with oil and scalp odor, forming a perfume all its own. If a modern perfume house bottled it, perhaps they would call it Eau de Henry, limited edition, guaranteed to make anyone faint. A light joke for you to sleep on if clear shampoo ads had existed in the 16th century. Henry VIII would have been the perfect real-life testimonial with the slogan, "No dandruff, no lice, no throne." The irony is that while his hair was filthy, Henry was proud of his beard. He trimmed and perfumed it carefully, brushed it to perfection. His thick red beard covered his face, but who would dare say aloud that it was only a filter for the foul mouth behind it? Records show Henry often wore hats and wigs to preserve his image, especially after his natural hair thinned. But wigs of the time were made of horsehair or human hair, rarely cleaned. Meaning, if his real hair was a lice stadium, his wigs were nothing less than luxury parasite apartments. You close your eyes and imagine a hall full of courtiers, each in embroidered brocade, heads adorned with peacock feathers. Yet beneath, all of them itching, scratching discreetly while conversing. The image of grandeur instantly becomes a collective comedy, and you realize hair was only the surface. Behind it lay the pillows, curtains, and the royal bed where Henry VIII shared his nights not only with his wives, but with an army of bizarre hygiene habits to his hair, beard, and insect-ridden bed. And then, a gentle thought crosses your mind. Henry, at the same time you feel gratitude. Gratitude that each morning you have clean water to wash your face, a toothbrush and toothpaste, a pillow that smells of sunlight, and most of all, that you do not have to sleep beside a 150-kilogram king with leg ulcers, grinding teeth, and a stench like a biological weapon in the night. Now let those images fade. In their place remain only steady breathing, gentle light in your own room, and the sense of safety, freshness, and comfort If outside your window you hear the wind or the hum of a fan, let it be the invisible blanket that covers you. I wish you a deep, peaceful sleep. No foul smells of the past, only the pleasant fragrance of the present. Close your eyes and smile at the thought if Henry VIII were alive. Surely he would envy you, an ordinary person drifting into a clean, quiet, happy sleep. Sleep well.